Hello and welcome to the 54th episode of NEOHUMAN podcast. I'm Agha Bahari, edagologist on Twitter and Instagram, and you can follow the show on liveandlimbo.com, iTunes, YouTube, and also BitChute. And today with me, I have the pleasure of having William B. Irvine. Thank you so much for being with us, William.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. And please call me Bill.
Bill. Excellent. How about we start from the beginning, the work you've done, and what are you mainly focused on now these days, Bill?
Okay, if you want the beginning, let's see. I'm a philosophy professor at Wright State University. In 2004, I guess when I turned 40 or 50, well, I had some kind of midlife crisis and somehow decided I was going to become a Zen Buddhist, that was the answer, and thought before doing that, of course, I needed to do research into Zen Buddhism. I also thought, since I'm a philosophy professor, that there might be an interesting way to get a double out of this. And by double, what I mean is I would not only resolve my midlife crisis, but I could also get a publication out of it. So I set about writing a book on human desire. And in the process of writing that book, got to look into Zen Buddhism. Buddhism itself is very concerned with human desire and our attempts to curb our desire. And to be complete, though, I had to consider other viewpoints on desire, and so one of them I had to do research on was Stoicism. I didn't have a particular interest in Stoicism. My only exposure to it in college, one of my majors was in philosophy, but my only exposure to the Stoics as a philosophy major was their logic. It turns out they were some of the preeminent logicians of the ancient world. And so I stumbled across the fact that they also had their own take on human desire and the sources of human dissatisfaction. And they give practical advice on dealing with desire and how to prevent unhappiness. I toyed with their advice. I took their advice to heart for a while and found, much to my amazement, that it was remarkably effective. And I had also looked deeper into Zen Buddhism and found that in Zen Buddhism, now, there are people who will have different interpretations of this, but my takeaway is that what you were waiting for is a moment of enlightenment. And you had to be a practicing Zen Buddhist for that moment to come. And sometimes the moment would come a day after you started practicing, and sometimes you would wait 30 years for your moment of enlightenment, if it came even then. And so it's an interesting choice between trying something and maybe 30 years from now having it work, or doing Stoic techniques and having them work very quickly. And so for me, it was an easy choice. And also, I seem to have an aptitude for the Stoic mindset. So that research came out in a book published in 2004 called On Desire, Why We Want What We Want. And I immediately decided I was going to follow that with a Stoic book. And that became my book, A Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy, which was published, I think, in 2006. And I did not have any clue that the world would have an interest in reading such a book. I thought, there might be a dozen people on the planet, but I thought it had to be written, and so I wrote it. And it got off to a slow start, but has done very well since then, and more than 10 years later, continues to do very well just in terms of sales and the number of people reached. I consider myself a teacher. So in that case, I take the book to be an example of teaching, of reaching people and showing them the role philosophy can play in their life. And as a result of that, I've done other books subsequently on Stoicism, including most recently my book titled The Stoic Challenge.
Yes, and your new book is called The Stoic Challenge, A Philosopher's Guide to Becoming Tougher, Calmer, and More Resilient. You mentioned the point and objective of enlightenment with respect to Zen Buddhism. My understanding of Zen has always been that I think Alan Watts has a quote talking about in Zen, the point of peeling the potato is not to make a stew or something. The point is just to peel the potato. Now, have you had any kind of a challenge about reaching a certain kind of a goal and objective rather than just focusing on being in the moment with both Zen and Stoicism? Because just based on the title of your book, the Stoic Challenge is being introduced for the purpose of becoming tougher, calmer, and more resilient.
I guess one of the things that struck me when I did the research for the book on desire was this notion of a philosophy of life, or you could also call it a philosophy for living. And what such a philosophy does is it tells you what the primary goal, your ultimate goal in living should be. And Buddhism defines that goal as what they call tranquility. And you have to be careful because that's a word that could be misunderstood. It doesn't mean, a kind of a zoned out state like being on tranquilizers. What it means is a life with as few negative emotions as possible. Negative emotions, things like envy, anger, anxiety. And a philosophy of life will embrace positive emotions, emotions like delight and even joy. But it'll give you a goal to aim at. And I was first struck that both the Stoics and the Buddhists agreed on the ultimate goal of life, that they said if you have sense, what you're going to aim for in life is not fame and fortune. It's not going to be the things, most people don't even have a coherent philosophy of life. They just live day to day. They know their goal of the day or their goal of the hour or their goal of the minute, but they don't have some bigger goal lurking behind those. But the Stoics and the Buddhists both agreed with this goal of tranquility in the sense I've described. So what makes them different philosophies of life? Well, they have remarkably different strategies for attaining that goal. So if you're a Zen Buddhist, you do lots of meditation, for instance, and you do try to stay in the moment. You do that kind of practice, and that's all very useful. In fact, I'm engaged in a course right now of meditation of that kind. But with the Stoics, it's a completely different approach. So it isn't a lot of meditation involved. Rather, it's ways to respond with the interesting situations that life presents you with. And it's also about staying grateful for the life you find yourself living. And then if you'd like, we can discuss some of their strategies, but that's one of the principal things to keep in mind. First, the notion of a philosophy of life provides you with a goal and provides you with strategies. And one of the primary Buddhist strategies is meditation, mindfulness, and that can play a role in Stoicism, but it isn't the role that the Stoics played up.
Yeah, I definitely want to discuss the strategies, but before that, let's define what Stoicism is and where it's coming from, and what is the definition of a Stoicism today if you see it as different than it used to be when it started thousands of years ago.
Okay, well, Stoicism came into existence in about 300 BC. A philosopher named Zeno of Citium decided he wanted to become a philosopher, and so he studied under various other philosophers. He figured that was the best way to do it. And in the process of doing so, was exposed to a variety of philosophies, including philosophies of life like skepticism and cynicism. And after a while, decided he wanted to form his own philosophy of life. And what he was going to do is blend together some of the other philosophies he had encountered. So back then, we didn't have universities, but you did have people who would become teachers, private teachers for other people. They would set up their own school of philosophy. And Zeno did that. And he was a Greek. And so he set up what became the Greek school of Stoicism. And again, if you say, what is Stoicism? It's a philosophy. But interestingly, he had other aspects to it. So besides being interested in the role, the idea of living a good life, he was also very much interested in logic. He was interested in science, and that wasn't unusual in the philosophers back then. The people they would have as students would typically have multiple kind of goals in being students. So a lot of them were young adults preparing for careers in law or careers in politics, and for those students, the logic would come in handy. But he thought, but to have a good life, it's more than just that you succeed at your job. You need a bigger game plan for succeeding at life. So he also provided his students with a philosophy for living. Most of the writings of the Greek Stoics have been lost, unfortunately. But in the first century AD, the doctrine was brought to Rome, and the Romans took it up and made it their own. My primary interest in Stoicism is in Roman Stoicism, and it's connected with names that a lot of people can have encountered. So I mentioned Zeno of Citium. Most people have never heard of him, but if you say, well, what about Marcus Aurelius? Oh yeah. He was a Stoic, and he wrote this book called The Meditations. Now, again, misleading title, because for him it didn't involve the kind of mindfulness meditation that a Zen Buddhist would do. Or people like Seneca, who is quite an interesting person. He's currently my favorite of the Stoic philosophers. He was not only a philosopher, but he was a counselor to an emperor. He was a playwright, he was a scientist, and he was also the first century equivalent of a billionaire. So he was quite a guy. Now Marcus Aurelius, of course, besides being a Stoic, was himself an emperor. So you have these people who are mixing together Stoicism with other aspects of life. And that's the kind of Stoicism that I think is most attractive to citizens of the 21st century. We have complicated lives we're living, and then the goal is, okay, and what is success? One measure of success is having a good life, and then what counts as having a good life? And the Roman Stoics, following in the footsteps of the Greek Stoics, gave an answer to that. They told us, well, you need to pursue tranquility in the sense that I've described. And they said, and here's how you do that.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned different types of Stoicism, Greek Stoicism and Roman Stoicism. What are the difference between the two?
The Romans, I think, have a much bigger emphasis on these strategies, these psychological strategies. So I mentioned that the Stoics had diverse interests, but they were the leading I think they were the leading psychologists of their time, and they had insights into the way the human mind works. Usually, if you're an unhappy person, you have only yourself to blame. You're choosing the wrong goals, and then when you reach those goals, you're no better off than you were before. And so they had insight into human psychology, and the Greeks seem to be more interested in simply in virtue. Roman Stoics were interested in that, but they have this whole psychological angle that I think is very attractive to many modern people who try it. We are right now experiencing a great Stoic renaissance. The number of people who are would call themselves practicing Stoics. Might have been a handful on the planet when I first became a Stoic, but now it's not unusual to encounter them. Certainly not online. If you're in the Silicon Valley, it turns out that's a hotbed of Stoicism within the United States, surprisingly enough. When I wrote A Guide to the Good Life, this would be in 2006, there were, I've done the numbers on this, and you can count the number on Amazon, the number of books that have Stoicism in the title. There were only 40, and most of those were written by academics for fellow academics, so they weren't particularly accessible. Recently I checked, and books on Stoicism on Amazon are coming out at the rate of 4 per week.
Wow.
So there's this huge upsurge of interest in Stoicism as a philosophy. And that's kind of as it should be, because it's very practical minded, gives you usable advice. And, whereas if you're going to be a Zen Buddhist, you might take a decade before it really kicks in. And my line on this is, Stoicism, hey, a 3-day weekend, give it a try, and you'll know by the end of that time whether it's working for you or not. And judging on the kinds of emails I get, and just the continued sales of Guide to the Good Life, there are a lot of people for whom it works.
Now, between A Guide to the Good Life that you said came out in 2006 and your new book, The Stoic Challenge, that came out earlier this year, it's 13 years of gap, and a lot has changed considering social media and socio-political dynamic and how people are communicating with each other. How do you see the kind of change that has been developed during that 13 years, and how Stoicism, the relevancy of it, has changed from your perspective from then, 2006, to now 2019?
I guess in my own activities, I did several other books in that interval. One of them was another Stoic book titled A Slap in the Face. And what it is it's an analysis of insults, because it turns out the Stoics were experts on insults, on how to deal effectively with insults. So that was a book in which I explored the psychology of insults, the politics of insults, and then you finally get to the Stoic advice on how to deal with them, which is kind of fun and kind of interesting and kind of useful. The best way to deal with an insult is to ignore it. You will deeply frustrate whoever it is who's trying to insult you. And if you have some wit and some presence of mind, often when you're insulted, it comes as a surprise. You didn't see it coming. But if you have some wit, there are other techniques you can use. So one of them favored by the Stoics was you respond by insulting yourself even worse than the insulter insulted you. Because that makes the insulter look like an idiot. You know what you're saying? Look, if you really knew me, that isn't the character flaw that you would pick. If you really knew me, you'd realize there are at least 5 other character flaws that I have that are much worse than that. So you are not well suited to analyze me. But thanks for the effort anyway. So you turn around the insult and you aim it right back at the source. But the other question you asked was the growth of interest in Stoicism. And I'm not a sociologist, so I'm really, I don't know. I can speculate, but I don't know. But one interesting phenomenon that lately I've been looking into is at the same time as Stoicism was rising, there was the rising of what you might call anti-Stoicism. These aren't people who are opposed to Stoicism, but they're people who take the opposite approach to life. A Stoic will take whatever life offers him and try to make the best out of what life has offered him. So the old saying is the glass half full or half empty. For the Stoic, the glass will be half full. And that's only the beginning, because he will say, and isn't it wonderful that I have water to drink at all? And isn't it wonderful that we have something like glass? It lets you see the water inside. And you can wash it, and it'll last for a long time. I must be one of the luckiest people around. That's a Stoic approach. The Anti-Stoics, these are people who seem to look for things to be unhappy about. They look for sources of things that they can complain about and complain about how unfair it is, and then declare to the world how their soul has been crushed by this injustice that's been done them. And that's another one of these sociological kind of trends, and I'm not quite sure why, but trying to go one level deeper in the psychology of this, I've often wondered whether there are people who just have they're wired with kind of a Stoic inclination, and for them, Stoicism comes easily. I think I am that way. I think I'm a person for whom I've kind of always lived in a low-grade Stoic fashion, and it was only late in life when I discovered, oh, somebody's already thought this through carefully. And I get emails from people who will reveal to me, they'll say, well, I've always been a Stoic. I just didn't have a fancy name for what I was. Well, more power to you. And even if you are, I call them a congenital Stoic. Even if you are a congenital Stoic, you still stand to benefit from the ancient Stoics, the Roman Stoics in particular, because they gave it a lot of thought, and you will pick up new Stoic techniques from them. And so you will be able to use this native talent that you possess. You'll be able to use it much more effectively in shaping your days and shaping your life.
It seems to me that unlike religions, Stoicism suggests certain strategies, as you said, and a framework and tools providing to a Stoic to reach his or her goal, compared to religion that sets very solid and uncompromisable kind of rules. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, the religion can actually coexist with Stoicism wonderfully, and in particular, Christianity has long had kind of a very hand-in-hand relationship with Stoicism. Realize Stoicism is concerned with your life. Christianity is concerned primarily, I would argue, and some people would take sides with this, but I would argue it's concerned with your afterlife. It says, why should you live a certain way today? Well, do you want to go to heaven, or do you want to go to the other place? Stoics, if you ask them, is there a heaven and a hell? They would say, don't know. Don't know, but one thing that's for sure is you're alive now, and probably you're going to be alive for a while, and you want that life to be the best possible. So Stoicism actually is quite compatible with Christianity, and you can pick other religions and say the same thing, because Stoicism is what? It's psychological strategies by which you can avoid experiencing negative emotions. And, if you're a Christian, you'd say, well, that's great. That's wonderful. And that, if you did that, you could have both a good life, and if you're a Christian, you could say a good afterlife too. But the Stoics didn't concern themselves with that. They didn't have rules. The Stoics didn't have rules. Christianity has a variety of rules. Didn't have rules. Stoics didn't have rules. They had strategies, and let me trot out one at this point. It's called negative visualization. And so what the Stoics suggest that you do as you go about your daily business, every now and then you set aside a moment in which you think about how your life could be worse. Now, you don't dwell on how your life could be worse. You allow yourself to have a flash, a flickering thought about how your life could be worse. So right now I'm sitting in a chair in a warm room. It's kind of cold and kind of windy outside where I am. And you know what? I'm lucky. I get to be inside. If I was outside, I'd be cold right now. That's one example. I mean, other examples. Think about the relationships that are important to you. Well, those relationships can end. In fact, those relationships will end, because sometimes they terminate while the people are still alive. But if nothing else, somebody's death, either yours or theirs, is going to end the relationship. And for a lot of people, just going through that quick exercise will remind you of how important that relationship is to you. And it'll make you value that relationship. Now, some people, when they hear this, are going to think, oh, well, that's not a, if the goal is to be a happy individual free of negative emotions, that seems like a crazy way to do it. You're just going to be thinking about death and losing everything you've got. And again, that's not what I'm saying. You don't dwell on it. You allow yourself to have a flickering thought of it, and then you get back to life. And it can have a profound impact on your psychological state. I mean, I know that's the effect it has on me. And I can find myself going from just a person with a bit of attitude into somebody who is absolutely thankful that I'm living the life I'm living, surrounded by the people who surround me, with what health I've got. And you can go through the whole list, because everything could be enormously worse. And I'm a lucky guy.
Mm-hmm. The reason I brought up religion, because I hear some people make the argument that, well, we are living in a very, as it's being portrayed by certain kind of perspectives, we're living in a divided kind of a time, at least within the Western civilization. People, believe completely different things, and they're fighting all the time with each other online. And if you watch the news, you think that the world is coming to an end and all of that. And some people are making the argument that we had certain kind of identity that was built on the basis of Judeo-Christian teachings and philosophy and rules and frameworks. And we went through a period of atheists being able to express themselves and convincing basically people that maybe religion is not the best way to approach your life. And that's why we have lost the sense of unity. We have lost the sense of moral ground upon which everything else is built upon. I disagree with that, but it seems to me that you don't necessarily have to believe in any kind of monotheistic kind of a religion to have ethics and unity with each other. You can just not believe, but you can practice Stoicism, for example, and grow yourself individually, because society is a reflection of individuals.
Yeah, I agree with that. Here's one way to think it through. So suppose you had two kids and you were watching them, and you realized that the two kids had a chance to steal and eat a donut. I don't know, you fill in your example here. And you watch, and you see both of them. This could be an experiment even, and you could watch them. And one kid eats a donut. Well, okay. Another kid sits there, and you can see him wrestling with himself, and yet doesn't eat the donut. Just sits there and leaves it be. And then a third kid also doesn't eat the donut. Okay, the first kid obviously doesn't have a whole lot of self-control. Second kid, you ask him, well, you didn't eat the donut. Did you want it? Oh, yeah, I wanted it bad. Why didn't you eat it then? Oh, because I'd get punished. Somebody would punish me, and I don't want to get punished. Okay. Third kid, who also didn't eat the donut, you ask him, did you want that donut? Oh, yeah, it looked delicious. Why didn't you eat it? Because it would have been wrong. Are you worried somebody would have punished you? And he says, no, regardless of whether somebody punished me or not, it would have been wrong. Now, you can take people. I've made the argument in various contexts that if you need religion to do the right thing, if you need the threat of punishment from God, you're actually a less moral person than if you do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. That if you're doing the right thing not to avoid punishment or not to get praise, but because it's the right thing to do, that, I think, is a higher level of morality than somebody who says, well, I did the right thing because, if God punishes me, I could go to hell, or I could have really bad luck. Well, that's a very self-interested kind of motive. And I don't even know if that would count as a moral motive for action. It's a self-interested motive for action.
One of the questions I keep asking, I bring philosophers and technologists, and we talk about many different areas, but I'm very interested in how we are reinterpreting the definition of humanity through our technological tools and technological advancement, artificial intelligence being one of them. And one of the questions I ask them is that whether they think ethics and morality is subjective or objective, because some believe that to create a more aligned artificial intelligence with the rest of our civilization, we need to interject some of our ethics and morality within that system. But the question is, if we really have any clear idea or clear agreement on what is it exactly that we are calling ethics and morality, because it seems to be different from society to society, from communities to communities.
Well, I think it's objective what morality is, and then it turns into a very interesting conversation of how you arrive at the ethical truths. But I've always thought that the fact that you have a culture where everybody agrees that something is okay to do is by no means an indication that that's the right thing to do. So, for instance, in the United States in 1860, slavery in the Deep South, if you went to Mississippi, everybody would have said, yeah, this is what God wants us to do. This is the right thing to do. And in fact, some of the slaves would have even bought into that. Well, it's the color of my skin means that this is my place to be the slave. My reaction to that is they were just wrong. They were mistaken. And there's different devices that you can use to try to make that point or to try to convince somebody of that point. And one of them is suppose I told you. So if you just think it's the culture, then suppose I told you that I had some kind of special powers and I could beam you back in time to Mississippi in 1860. And then which body you would inhabit back then was a matter of chance. So, you know what? You could be a slave owner. You could be a slave. Would you agree to that? Would you say, yeah, sure, send me there? Or would you come up with a different destination? A place where they didn't have slavery and where people were treated with respect and their property was respected. And most people would say, well, that's a no-brainer. I'm not going to go to the first place. There's this notion that's come up that you're not supposed to be judgmental of other people. And I don't regard that. I mean, you have a choice. If you're a moral person, you have a choice of, first of all, doing the right thing yourself, and then, the second choice of whether to comment on other people's morality. I think there are probably times when, to be a moral person, you have to comment on other people's morality because it's one way to prevent, injustice to your fellow human beings. But then you go online and people are highly judgmental, partly because the internet lets them do it from behind a veil of anonymity. So they can try to wreck somebody's day or life without danger of any kind of blowback to themselves.
Aside from being judgmental, a lot of people seems to have capitalized on the sense of victimhood as well. Even if it's not about them necessarily, like you mentioned slavery, some people are saying that because our ancestors were slaves, we deserve to receive special kind of rights or a special kind of a treatment, or any other kind of an individual, because all of us, we can find something to feel victimized about, and it seems to have been made into an instrument of asking for special rights and gaining power, and in many cases political power.
Yeah, so you've raised two separate issues there. One is the whole issue of being a victim, and the Stoics would be very clear on this. They would say, you get to choose whether you're a victim or not. You don't get to choose whether you're a target of injustice or not. So there can be times in life when somebody makes you the target of injustice, and they're very powerful individuals, and what they want happens, and you've been targeted, and bad things have been done to you. But they said, and that's something we don't have control over. So that's how it worked for you. But there's something you have considerable control over, and that is whether you choose to play the role of victim. In playing the role of victim, you're going to sit around and say, it's so sad and my life is so miserable and they've wrecked my life and there's nothing left to it. And if you look back at the ancient Stoics themselves, the Roman Stoics, again, are my favorite. A lot of them managed to get themselves into trouble, and so they would have been exiled. In some cases, they would have been executed. And what's interesting, and it would have been unjust, but what's interesting is how well they took it. So Musonius Rufus, who's one of the lesser Roman Stoics, was exiled to one of the least desirable places. And so what did he do on the island? He made the most of it. He realized, so I've been targeted, but I'm not going to play the role of victim. I'm going to take what I've got, where I am, and I'm going to do with it what I can, which is a wonderful kind of approach. The second sort of thing you triggered my thinking about is there is a claim, for instance, that some people say that there should be restitution for slavery. So if they have ancestors who were slaves, then that entitled them to some kind of restitution. And that's an interesting claim, and you can weigh the merits of that claim. But one of the things to keep in mind is a lot of the people who have ancestors who were slaves also have ancestors who were slave owners. Mm-hmm. Thomas Jefferson had perhaps 6 children by a slave. Sally Hemings, a slave. And then you can follow their lines of descent down to people who currently exist. And they can all say, Sally Hemings, a slave, is an ancestor of mine. And then there's this interesting follow-up. Well, so was Thomas Jefferson. He was a slave owner. He was also a president. So you're gonna encounter these practical difficulties when it comes to reparations for slavery.
Yeah, I guess a lot of people who are victimizing themselves, they don't even want to get to those places. When once you start talking about logical grounds, they just call you names and shut off the conversation. That's a problem.
That's an unfortunate thing. My next research project is on critical thinking and the kind of psychology that's in play when you try to have a conversation with somebody. It's just worse than ever of them thinking they don't actually need to give reasons for what they believe, that if you come up with good reasons on your side, then the proper response is simply to shut you up or shout you down. That's unfortunate because we need all the thinking we can. It's could save us from some real bad situations in the world.
Absolutely. Bill's new book is called The Stoic Challenge: A Philosopher's Guide to Becoming Tougher, Calmer, and More Resilient. So let's discuss some of the strategies. You mentioned 2 of them. What are some of the strategies that you would like to share with people who are living in this day and age and dealing with everything that we have to deal with in this modern life that we're experiencing?
Okay, one of them I mentioned is this negative visualization. Mm-hmm. And you give yourself a moment to think about how things could be worse. There are other variants on that. One of the things you can realize if you're kind of just having a nothing day, dragging through a day, realize that whatever that you're doing, one thing to keep in mind is there will be a last time to do. You will do whatever you're doing. So I use this sometimes when I'm out. Hot summer day, I have to go out and mow the lawn. So I go out to mow the lawn, and I can do that, thinking, "Man, this is no fun at all," and I wish I didn't have to do this. But then another thought to entertain when you're doing it is the realization that there will be a last time in your life that you mow the lawn. This could be it. And that if you live long enough, there will be a time in your life when you will look back and wish you were young and healthy enough to be mowing a lawn. You're living right now. the dream world of the future you. This assumes that you live long enough, because with the passage of time, you're going to lose abilities. Things are going to happen. Look back at your own youth. I mean, look at all the things you could do when you were 15 that you can't do now. The things that just came so easily to you. And if you could be young again, wouldn't that be great? Well, if you live long enough, you're going to have that same fantasy. Only if you could be young again means whatever age you are now. So in my case, if I live to be 100, I'll think back to when I was, let's see, what am I? 67. I'll look back and say, boy, if I could only have those years over again. Well, I've got them. I'm living them. And you know what? I should take full advantage of them. I should soak up what they have to offer. Another strategy to use if you're a Stoic is when things happen to you in life and you're thinking, how should I respond to the things that have happened? The primary thing to keep in mind is you ask yourself, well, what do I have control over? And the Stoics were very clear on the importance of you in your life keeping distinguished the things you have control over and the things you don't have control over. And their advice is you need to be worrying about things you do have control over because you have control over them. The things you don't have control over, you're just wasting your time. You're causing yourself needless grief, needless anxiety. So let me give you a concrete example of this. Suppose you're a competitive tennis player and you're coming up on some important match. And then the question is, what should you do to prepare for it? A lot of people will just burn up a time and energy, psychic energy, thinking about the other side and thinking about how worried they are about what the other side's going to do. Stoic advice, if you had a tennis coach who was a Stoic, here's the advice you'd get. Well, think about the things you can't control. You can't control the game they're going to play. You can't control how good they are. You can't control how strong they are. So don't think about it. What can you control? You can control how hard you practice. You can control your strategy going into the game. And so if you have any sense at all, you're going to take your time, your energy, focusing on the things you can control, and you're going to prepare, train to the best of your ability. You're going to go in with the best game strategy you can think of. You know what? If that doesn't do it, what else could? Nothing could. If that doesn't win you the game, then winning the game just wasn't in the cards. But it's certainly possible for you to lose a game that you could have won if you allow yourself to be distracted by the things you have no control over. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of energy. So the Stoics would go on to point out that among the things you have control over, you have very great or even absolute control over many of your own personality traits and character traits. So, for instance, to be honest is a choice you can make, and you have it in your control. So you should make it. To be a caring individual is something you can decide to do. It may not come naturally to you, but you can decide to do it, and it'll affect your life, the quality of your life. It'll affect your relationships. The idea, though, do you have control over whether somebody becomes your friend or not? No, you can affect whether somebody becomes a friend or not, but you can't control it. So the Stoics analysis, we waste so much of our time thinking or dwelling on things we can't control. And that's stupid because we can't control them. So those are examples of their strategy. And when I look back at the advice they give, and I realize it was only in the second half of the 20th century that psychologists started thinking in these same terms, and they developed some of the same strategies as the Stoics had. One of them is this whole notion of framing. So in my book, The Stoic Challenge, it's about setbacks. And when you experience a setback in life, Some people, when they do, that's it. That's the end of the game. They just say, oh, no, I got setback, so I give up. Other people, when setback, have the ability to bounce back and overcome the setbacks they're experiencing. Part of the question is how you frame a setback. If you're set back and you respond by playing the role of victim, well, that's too bad. It's going to be a personally tragic thing for you. But when you're set back, if you instead say, well, it's not a setback, it's a challenge. And it's a challenge I'm going to do my best to rise to. Interestingly, if you look at some of the world's most successful people, you'll find that one of the things that's true of them is the remarkable number of failures they experienced. So success typically arises out of multiple failures. And you can look at successful athletes, you can look at successful business people. This seems to be true. It's the case that they were set back. What made the difference? They bounced. They found a workaround, or they just said, hey, I failed. Let's see, what can I learn from that failure? Because I'm going to take a new approach, different approach, where I might make new mistakes, but I'm not going to make that same mistake again. And it turns out that approach to life can have a huge impact on where you end up in life.
I totally agree. The example that you used for the athletes, it immediately reminded me of sumo and sumo wrestling. I love sumo and I'm following it. And beside watching it as a beautiful sport, a part of it has always, for me, has always been how these guys are focused on their match that day. And when they're talking to them, that, okay, what happened? They talk about, okay, this is what happened. And they're like, are you thinking about championship? And every single time they're saying, I'm just focused on my next match. And I'm focused on doing the best sumo that I can do.
Yeah. And if your best isn't good enough, you do not need to regret. You do not need to apologize. You did your best. But of course, most people fall short of doing their best because they fear failure. And this notion of you don't go out of your way to fail, but you realize that if you're doing something hard, failure is a possibility. It's maybe even a likelihood if you're doing something really hard. The Stoics went out of their way to do hard things just because they were hard. And, for them, it was the idea that resilience didn't necessarily just come naturally, that it's something you could develop. And the way to develop it was to experience difficult, unpleasant, uncomfortable situations, and then deal with the setbacks those situations presented. You walk away a stronger human being, somebody who is more self-confident, somebody who has the ability to bounce instead of break when life presents them with a setback.
And I'm glad that we started this conversation with you saying that you became a Stoic after 40. That you got into Zen and Stoicism after 40. So it's not like people have to get into it early in their life. Otherwise, they're going to miss out understanding a point of it or anything like that. At any point, I would imagine it doesn't matter what age you are. It's just a matter of perspective and the will. Is that right?
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. I had assumed that Stoicism worked best for older people, but I have subsequently found that is very much a mistake. I think you have to have experienced some challenges in life in order to really appreciate what Stoicism has to offer. But there are people challenged at any ages you can name. So sure, young and old alike. And the strategies, again, work at all ages. Adolescence has its own challenges, and they're really tough challenges if you think back of how hard it was to be a teenager. So maybe they're a ripe audience for this, but first of all, they have to know that it exists, and they have to want to put it to work in their life.
What are some of the resources you would recommend for Stoicism aside from your books?
Well, let's see. I've read a lot of psychology, and so there are modern behavioral psychologists who have looked into the same things that the Stoics were talking about. So somebody who said, who was interested primarily in the psychology that lies behind the strategies, could look at, let's see, there's the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Is a wonderful book, and what he's done is very carefully, through careful psychological experimentation, he and his colleague, whose name I'm blanking on right now, did experiments in which they tested out a number of psychological strategies in order to see the tricks the human mind plays on us, and more importantly, the way to avoid those tricks. So that's a useful thing to read. The Stoics themselves, even though they're philosophers, a lot of philosophy is simply very difficult for a non-philosopher to read, but that's not true of the Stoics. Marcus Aurelius, his Meditations, it's just his notebook. Wasn't intended for publication, just a notebook of observations about what he sees in life and how people can deal with the challenges life presents. So he has a lot of fans. He's got to be the best-selling of the Stoics. And there's books. Massimo Pugliesi's How to Be a Stoic is a wonderful book. And in each of the books I've written, I have a section of recommended reading, so they can check that as well.
Excellent. Bill's new book is called The Stoic Challenge: A Philosopher's Guide to Becoming Tougher, Calmer, and More Resilient. You mentioned that next you are going to do a study about how to have conversations. What is next for you aside from that, and where can people follow your work?
Let's see. I have a website, williambirvin.com.
You're not on Twitter, though, right? I couldn't find your
Twitter.
Yeah.
No, I'm a geezer. All of this, and I'm realizing more than ever how my world has changed. The first book that I published would have been in the early 2000s, and it was a physical paper manuscript, and I would send it back and forth to the editor, and it'd be this huge box, paper 3 inches thick, and there'd be this time lag between when you did it and when you came back. And now it's all electronic. And the book I'm currently working on, I'm making a goal that there will be no paper that I consume in the production of the book. So it's all on word processor. But the other thing I'm realizing, it used to be that in order to successfully sell a book, you needed to get book reviews. And the book reviews, to a considerable extent, have become secondary. Now, a sensible author, I'm not a sensible author, but if I were, I'd be working social media, and I'd have a Facebook page, and I would be Twittering, and I would be doing all of this other stuff. And I should be, but... I'm from the wrong generation, apparently, which is no excuse at all. And following me, I don't know. The notion of followers. And again, if I want to sell books, I'm talking terrible. But the notion of followers. Well, if you want to follow me, read what I've written, and that's the best of me that there is, because I spend a lot of time carefully choosing words and putting them down for the world to consume. But yeah, there are people, who are followed on a daily basis by vast numbers of people, which is one of these social phenomena that I don't really understand. But I'm an outlier, so I'm to blame. I realize that that's just an issue I have. But certainly one of the things they can do if they want to dip a toe into Stoicism. So on the Stoic website, williambirvin.com, I have a whole bunch of Stoic essays that I've written. And these are typically like 900-word things. They're available for free. and you can take a look at them, and it's practical advice of Stoicism in your daily life. What sorts of things can it do for you? And so that would be an interesting way for them to dip in a toe and see if they like the water.
Excellent. Well, it certainly has been a pleasure talking to you. Let me ask you the last question that I ask all my guests. That if you come across an intelligent alien from a different civilization, what would you say the greatest thing that we have done as humanity, and what would you say is our worst achievement?
Worst achievement is our inhumanity to each other, which expresses itself routinely. And you take almost any culture. It's interesting to try to find exceptions to this. And there have been these periods of time when a bunch of people in the same place have gone crazy. Let's see, Germany. Oh yeah, there was that World War I thing and that World War II thing. Well, what about France? Oh yeah, the French Revolution where people were being beheaded. What about Rwanda? Oh yeah, there was that little incident when neighbors started killing neighbors, and about a third of the population died. What about the United States? Well, there was slavery. There was the witchcraft thing going on. And you realize what a shallow, fragile thing human culture is, how it's possible for people to live side by side in harmony and then just start killing each other. And then the sad thing is, could it happen again? Could it happen here in America where I am? And the answer is yes. And if we think we're special and different, the answer is no, because we deep down are human beings. That's the great human tragedy. On the positive side, we've done some magnificent things as far as people helping people is concerned. We have raised the level of prosperity, and this is a mixed blessing, of course. But you think back, where were we 50,000 years ago, or 70,000? We were in the savannas of Africa. And look at how far we've come. And look at the artistic productions and the scientific productions. So we are capable, we are gods, we are monsters, and we just switch identities with the passage of time, apparently. So bittersweet. It's a bittersweet state of affairs.